Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. It's wonderful to have you all on board our AI for All virtual conference. Next session on our agenda is the role of artificial intelligence in combating financial crime. Our esteemed speakers are Senior Managing Partner, FTI Consulting, Dr. Richard Palmer; Senior Managing Director, Partner, FTI Consulting, Ms. Federica Taccogna; Director at FTI Consulting, Mr. Benzaki. Welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Thank you, Emil. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody is doing well and keeping safe. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the BIBF and Bahrain Polytechnic for their great efforts in organizing this event and for giving us the opportunity to be with you today and speak about artificial intelligence, which is a topic that is near and dear to our hearts, as well as the role of artificial intelligence and how it plays a vital role in our lives as experts. So my name is Benzaki. I'm a director with FTI Consulting, and I'm joined today by our financial crime experts, Mr. Richard Palmer, who is our Senior Managing Partner in Technology and is based in the UK, as well as Ms. Federica Taccogna, who is also our Senior Managing Partner in Financial Services and is also based in the UK. They'll be sharing some very interesting insights on insights on their firsthand experience in how elements of AI, such as machine learning and advanced analytics, is used to combat financial crime. So before I pass over to Richard, I just want to spend a few minutes just to talk about us. So FTI Consulting is a global professional services firm that is headquartered in Washington, DC. Since its founding in the early 1980s, the firm has grown from a few hundred to over 6,000 employees, based in 28 countries across the world, and focusing or specializing in 5 main segments, being corporate finance and restructuring, economic and finance consulting, forensic and litigation consulting, strategic communications, and technology. In EMEA, in the EMEA region, our main office is based in London. And in the Middle East, our presence is across the GCC with our main office operating in the UAE. You know, in our financial crime practice, FTI is involved in a lot of complex investigations. Such cases like this where there's a lot of data involved. For example, the infamous Madoff Ponzi scheme, which FTI was heavily involved with in the early 2000s. Such investigations require analyzing a vast amount of documentation, sometimes reviewing thousands of customer accounts and hundreds and millions of transactions. So the use of innovative solutions in mass data analytics or pattern recognition or process automation really helps to focus or narrow down the focus of the review. Similarly, perpetrators, as we are all aware, are always looking for new ways to commit crime. And as their schemes grow in complexity, so too must our reliance on technologies, not only to detect and deter these activities, but also to help us find the right solutions and answers quickly, accurately, and ultimately to the benefit of our clients, who can then form the best decisions. So with that, we will now go into some of these innovations, and I'll pass it over to Richard. Richard?
I think I'm off mute. Is that correct, Zaki? Just put your hand up if I'm off mute.
Yeah, I can hear you, Richard. Go ahead.
Oh, is the audience seeing the slides?
Yes, they can see the slides.
Hi there. Good morning. Thanks, Zaki, for that. And thanks to the conference organisers for giving us the opportunity to speak this morning. So my name is Richard Palmer, and I'm going to give an overview of AI and financial crime as we just spoke. I've got 3 decades of experience working in this space. I've been focused on consumer industries in most of that time, with an extensive amount of work in financial services. So firms I've worked at and where my experience is based includes American Express, Barclays Bank, Lloyds Bank in the UK, done work for Visa Cards, National Commercial Bank in Saudi Arabia, and Standard Bank in South Africa. So extensive experience across a fairly wide range of financial services institutions. Next page, please, Zaki. So over this time, I've seen a wide variety and a change in the use of AI in financial services. And what I've done here is to plot out kind of the maturity against time and some of the areas in which AI has been deployed. As we look at maturity, obviously we all know about growth in computing power over these decades. Digital transformation in organizations has also driven this. Much more data is electronically captured nowadays, which makes itself amenable to artificial intelligence techniques. Zaki, I don't think people can see the slides. Are we able to bring those up? I'll carry on talking, and I think the slides hopefully will come up. There it goes. Thank you. Perfect. Thank you. So as I said, the maturity axis, we got compute power has grown exponentially over the last few decades. Digital transformation has driven a lot more data capture in electronic formats, which makes itself amenable to AI. There's also been experience and acceptability by business for these techniques over this period of time, and that's important. I'll get to this point in a second. What's also interesting is actually the underlying techniques themselves has not changed that much. If you hear about deep learning techniques now, they're still leveraging techniques which were pioneered in the 1950s and 60s with neural networks and other computation methods. So it's interesting that the underlying techniques themselves haven't, but it's the compute power, the availability of data, and the business and acceptability of using these techniques. So when I started my career, I was focusing mainly on marketing and promotional activities. So we are looking at campaign effectiveness, direct mail targeting, and offer selection and pricing. So various areas which have a relatively low hurdle for acceptance and proof. As time went by, these techniques started to get used operationally, where there's a higher hurdle for acceptability and proof. Credit and risk decisioning, for example, fraud monitoring, quants trading strategies are all areas where AI started to be adopted in the 2000s in operational arenas. Lastly, regulatory and compliance. This probably has the highest hurdle in acceptability and proof. And therefore, as a result, has been only recently adopted AI. Areas in this would include robo-advice for investments. So this is a growing area where a robot can advise on investment strategies for a customer. Customer complaints handling. This is a very big topic. How do you handle very large volumes of customer complaints effectively? AI can now start to be used in that arena. And what we're going to talk about today is compliance and monitoring, specifically with a financial crime perspective. So only recently has the techniques become mature enough to use in the fight against financial crime, which is what we're going to talk about now. Next page, please, Zaki. So as we look at financial crime, I see there's 3 primary areas of focus, and I'm going to go through each one of these in turn. The first one is KYC, sanctions, money laundering, and terrorist financing. And Fed's going to talk about terrorist financing in a second. In these areas, banks have unwittingly become the conduit for crime. The facilitators are sitting outside the banks. They're using the banks as a conduit to flow monies around the globe. Occasionally there might be collusion, but ostensibly most of this is where the banks are just unwittingly facilitating. We use AI in this arena. We're looking at KYC records, know your customer records, which the bank should have captured on their various banking counterparties, and transactions. And really what we're focusing on is who is the bank dealing with. We're looking at individuals, corporates, and other banks in the banking network. And as Zaki described earlier, billions of transactions we might be analyzing for some of our clients who get caught up in some of these criminal waves. The second one here is trader abuse and market manipulation. This is where the banks themselves are orchestrating financial crime. They are manipulating the markets. They're taking advantage of large client orders, which they know are going to move the market in a certain direction. This happens either by an individual at a bank, but more often in syndicates and in collusion between individuals, either at a bank or between banks. This requires us to use AI looking at both electronic communications and transactions themselves. So we have to fuse multiple data sources here in order to apply the AI to understand what's happening. FX is probably the most recent, foreign exchange is the most recent wave of investigatory effort by the global regulators. And I'm going to share a case study in FX market manipulation in a second. The last type of financial crime we call employee and third-party threat. And this is where the banks themselves are the victims. This could be bribery and corruption. It could be IP theft. There's a whole number of areas in which employees might be sharing that information with other third parties to their advantage, but to the detriment of the bank themselves. Where there is crime, there is always money. So what is our focus? We're looking at flows, money flows. So where are there unusual transactions? Where are the invoice descriptions a little bit vague as to what the bank is actually buying? Are there unusual suppliers? Are there one-off payments to suppliers you've not seen before? Are there new suppliers being brought in unexpectedly? So these are the sort of telltale indicators that there might be some money flow going out of the organization in response to bribery and corruption or IP theft. In these examples, we'll be using AI to look at invoices, looking at sales records, looking at T&E systems, for example, all the ways in which money flows through the organization. So where does FTI get involved? As Zaki described earlier, we're involved in all of these issues. And we can be involved across the whole matter life cycle. And I've described here at the bottom of the page what we mean by the matter life cycle. Stage one is the investigation phase. This is disclosure of what happened. What were the events? What happened? And also, regulators are always interested in who knew what when, who was involved, was the chief executive involved, was there indications that other senior members of the organization were involved, or was it just a rogue employee? These are all the focus of the investigate phase. The second phase is what we call remediate. Typically, you're looking at what we describe as the back book. You might have fines to settle with the regulators. You might need to calculate those fines on some methodology. There might be some customer detriment, which you've got to make good. You've got to reach out to your customers and you've got to pay them back whatever damages you might have caused. And there might be class actions. So you might need to defend against class actions. And in the FX investigation, which I described, all of these were a part of that remediate, a very long tail of activity. From investigate to remediate was about 3 to 5 years, and there are still ongoing class actions against some of the banks in the FX. So this can take a long period of time. It can be multiple years through the matter life cycle. The last piece, and most importantly, is the comply piece. Once you've identified the issues, how do you prevent those from reoccurring? And this is where we're interested in taking learnings from the investigation and applying those into the controls environment to prevent those occurring going forwards. Zaki, next page. So where exactly does AI machine learning get involved? Basically, there's two areas in which we're focused. Firstly is looking for patterns which are relevant to the financial crime to aid investigation. We call this getting to relevance. What's important in a matter? Certain dates, certain employees, certain counterparties, focus on particular events, i.e. around a market announcement where there might be grounds and potential for market abuse and misconduct. So that's where we would support investigations, is getting to the relevance quickly. And secondly, as I described earlier, in the compliance, is taking insights from the investigation into the controls environment to prevent further abuses. And as Zaki described earlier, there's always new types of abuse being perpetrated. So therefore, to close this loop is a continual activity. This is never done. You're never finished. You're always investigating, and you're always trying to remediate and improve your controls environment. Next page, please, Zaki. I'm going to dive a little bit into the sorts of techniques we apply when we talk about AI and machine learning. And for those of you who aren't familiar, there's basically two modes of operation. We call them pattern detection, you know what you're looking for, and anonymity detection, which potentially you don't know what you're looking for, but you're looking for things which appear to be unusual. These are often also called supervised learning and unsupervised learning. And each one of these have certain issues which need to be overcome, and that's what our focus is. In pattern recognition, the biggest challenge is what we call false alerts. There's a lot of surveillance tools available in the marketplace, but they can generate a very large number of alerts and overwhelm the compliance organizations which are monitoring these alerts. So that's always a big topic. And the second one is tuning and calibration. Regulators will always challenge an organization that they're not just using what they describe as out-of-the-box settings. Any compliance monitoring tool needs to be calibrated to the business and the risks of the organization. So those are the challenges around pattern recognition. Anonymity detection, the major challenge is classification. Once something abnormal has been detected, that needs to be classified. And typically this is where an expert would be involved. Once it's classified, these patterns can be tagged and used for future pattern recognition. So there's an implicit feedback loop here between pattern recognition and anonymity detection. And these techniques are typically used in conjunction with each other. Next page, Zaki, please. I'm now going to describe a typical case study, which I think will illustrate some of these techniques I've just described in a real life example. So this is a trader misconduct case. The client was a tier 1 bank involved in the FX market manipulation. This is foreign exchange market manipulation. The challenge was that there was over 1 billion data points over a 6-year period of time. So a colossal amount of data which needed to be investigated. And the second challenge was there's multiple risks. So the regulators weren't just looking at one type of market abuse. They had a list of 20 to 30 different types of abuse which they believed the banks were perpetrating. So we had a lot of data and a lot of different risks which we needed to investigate against. So our involvement was in looking at the data, identifying abnormal trading behavior, and classifying that against those various risks. The output of our work was used directly to settle with the regulators. Collectively across the industry, there's over 10 billion of fines paid. Additionally, There were some very large class actions. Some of these are still underway, and there's another 500 odd million who are paid back to the various claimants who are caught up and were detrimented in this. So the output from our work was material and significant in this matter. Zaki, next page, please. So what I'm going to do is show here, and this is a very stylized and sanitized example of the data we were dealing with. We're looking here at a graph which is frequency of trade. Frequency of trade was thought to be a key indicator of benchmark manipulation. If you want to move a benchmark for FX, you have to conduct a lot of trades. The benchmarks typically are compiled out of aggregate trading volumes in certain periods of the day. What we've got here is 6 years of data, and each one of these bars represents trading activity in a minute. So there's a lot of data, a lot of data points we're looking at. But what is interesting and evident from here is that there were certain days and certain minute periods where the volume was excessively high. And we've marked those A to E. What we did was identify those from the underlying data and pass those particular events to an investigator. This was the law firm working on behalf of the bank. They investigated those particular events and specifically looked at the electronic communications associated with those events to help us classify those. They would either mark those as anonymity cases. Yes, we believe there was intent to collude at that point in time. A tick, this is a real hit, if you will. Or they'd mark them as good trading, as in we don't believe there was anything material happening at this point in time, given the other evidence. So this is how we're starting to use anomaly detection, classification using an expert, and then we can feed that back into the process. What we're able to establish is certain patterns of trade, which gave a very high statistical confidence and correlation to the regulatory review and investigation looking at the electronic communications, such that we were able to evidence these patterns and use these admissible into court and to defend the bank against the trading acquisitions. Last page, please, Zaki. Once we had built and tested those patterns, we were able to take those into the controls environment. This is a stylized graph of how we built the controls environment. We were building what was called T+1 surveillance solution. We took data on a daily basis from the bank. We assimilated those into our data model. We then ran those patterns, those known patterns, against that data. We were then able to generate alerts. We flew those alerts into a case flow management tool, which was then exposed to the client's compliance teams to process. This process was used to attest to the global regulators that they had effective controls in place. And 4 years later, it's still being used by the bank using the same patterns which had been identified during the investigation. So that illustrates how we're able to take an entire issue through the life cycle and use the insights from investigations into the compliance. I'm now going to hand over to Fed, who's going to talk about terrorist financing. Fed, over to you.
Thank you, Zach. If you want to go to the next slide, you've heard already the introduction from me. You can leave it to my face for a moment whilst I introduce myself, Zaki. Thank you very much. I'm a partner at FTI. I head a practice that investigates financial crime. We do it in two ways. On one hand, we work with the regulated firms to help them identify when they have been implicated in financial crime, and we help them build better controls. But most importantly, we investigate on behalf of regulators, enforcement agencies, FIUs, and similar. I'm, for example, appointed by the government in the UAE, helping them manage their response to FATF. and have been appointed by the Guardia di Finanza, the various FIUs. We worked with the FBI and with the DOJ, investigating some of the laundromats, for example, of which we've heard about in the headlines, various cases of Vatican corruption, human trafficking, drug dealing, all these incredibly beautiful things that at some point make their way through the financial services system. Why do I say that? Is because none or the majority of what we do would be possible without the application of a certain degree of technology, most often artificial intelligence. I could be here talking to you for the rest of the day about case studies. There was one in particular that I wanted to show to you because visually it's quite impactful. Zach, if you want to go to the next slide. In this case, we were working for the Financial Conduct Authority in the UK. And this was a dual track, a criminal and a regulatory investigation at the same time. The target entity is a major high street bank. I can't say the name, but think that major bank, that one. So we were looking into this bank, and actually the regulator had already some concerns relating to the bank, but they needed someone completely independently to either prove or disprove. So what happened was that they couldn't tell us what the problem was. They literally came to us and said, here is the data. Can you tell us if you see anything? We think that this bank has been involved in some nefarious activity, but we can't tell you anything. Can you please look at this bank and tell us if you see anything wrong? And it was a lot of data, 500 million transactions in excess of. 500 million is when we stopped counting. And the data at the beginning looked something like this, Zaki, if you want. Literally, it was a blob of nothing. Now, this is the graphical representation. We were also looking at it in Excel. This is what we saw. And we had about a month to figure out what to look for. And we tried with traditional systems. You know, we have a series of rules that we implement whenever we are looking for anomalies in data. And those rules were generating so much noise. We were seeing things, but we were also doubting ourselves as to whether we were seeing the right things because there was a lot of noise. And that's where we understood that deploying artificial intelligence was going to be the only way to go about it. So we let, first of all, the machine run with it, and the machine started seeing something. And if you go further, Zaki, we will see that the machine starts making some sense of these patterns, some sense of these outliers. It starts showing us that there are some behaviors that are a little bit anomalous compared to the rest. And then we put our experts looking at those anomalies and validating which ones were true anomalies and which ones instead were not real anomalies, but just blips in the data. And as we went on, Zaki, we started seeing something that made even more sense. And we repeated the pattern. And if you go to the next slide, finally, it started to make much more sense. And if you take us to the last slide, please, we understood what was going on. We wrote a report and we said, yes, out of this 11,000 customers that we've looked at, there were 22 that were involved in some serious financial terrorist financing activity. Some of these were terrorists that have blown themselves up somewhere in another country. So it wasn't kind of low-key activity, it was serious terrorist financing activity. And we wrote the report and we gave it to the bank, and it turned out that it matched 100% the concerns and the court case that the bank was going to make. We could be here and draw conclusions from that extensively, but what can we take away from this? First of all, that the machine alone is not what is needed. The machine paired with the experts in that loop is what makes this all work. The second thing that I didn't tell you is that we have to give some inputs to the machine. We have to feed some data into it, and we have to enrich it in some way. And the patterns that we utilized to initially train the machine were patterns that had nothing to do with financial services or even financial crime. There were patterns taken from the world of social media. And so that's the second takeaway, is to think as widely as possible. Artificial intelligence gives us that ability to introduce more into the equation, and therefore doing it is very important. And then the third thing, which is, this is a case relating to an investigation, and it worked for us. However, what I'm still rather disappointed to see is that financial institutions could apply these same concepts and principles to their BAU controls. They could apply the same principles that we've just described here to their transaction monitoring efforts, for example, and achieve a much better detection of financial crime. And yet the industry is not at that point, but we have evidence that it works. I am running late, so despite the fact that I'm an extreme geek on the topic and I could be here for the rest of the day, I hope that this has been insightful. And I thank you